So we recorded most of this show on Tuesday, but right now it's Wednesday afternoon. We're recording this from the corner of Mulberry in Jersey, where I am hopping on a New York Public Library Wi-Fi from the street. Catch us up.
Well, I mean, the first thing that happened after we recorded was, of course, that a U.S.-Japan trade deal was announced via a Truth Social post by the president. And so everyone, was sort of wondering if we were going to get that, and then it did. And at first, it looked like it was going to be an entirely one-sided deal, and then details started trickling out. It's actually not. It's probably about as good of a deal as Japan could have hoped for. And then a few hours later, I was getting ready to go to bed. My phone rings, and it is Bloomberg in Hong Kong saying, "Can you be on TV in 20 minutes? We just got news that Prime Minister Ishiba is going to resign." So I look at my phone, and I see that there's one. It was a scoop from the Mainichi Shimbun, like a center-left daily newspaper, and technically it wasn't that he was resigning. It was that he had told sources that he was planning on announcing his resignation within the next few weeks. So, it was not quite, "I'm going to resign," but it seemed pretty definitive. It's now been pretty much confirmed by other sources. Ishiba himself has not officially confirmed it, but it seems like it's more or less a done deal, that in a couple weeks he will officially confirm that he's leaving. And the other thing that has happened in the interim is also that his support in the party is collapsing. There's a lot of calls for him to quit. They've become much more vocal after the story broke. So he looks like he's done, even if he doesn't seem to know it entirely yet.
Let's do a little Japanese media literacy lesson. I mean, if you're saying people got more vocal after the story came out, seems like there are a lot of folks who have some incentive for a story to come out if they want to see change happen. Um, do you buy it? Or is this, I mean, is there a way for the tail to wag the dog here, where a story like this comes out, even if it's not actually what he was meaning, and then that sort of emboldens the LDP membership in such a way that it's hard for him to keep everything in?
I'm not ruling that out entirely, although I do wonder, though, whether the trade deal announcement actually was the more important development, in that, to some extent, the fact that there hadn't been a trade deal and that you had this August 1st deadline looming over everything made, I think, some people reluctant to say Ishiba should go, because they didn't want to jeopardize those talks while they were ongoing. There was hope that you'd get some deal done that would spare Japan from 25% tariffs on August 1st. But once that deal was announced, essentially Ishiba made himself obsolete. All the people who were holding back because they didn't want to hurt the trade negotiations. Well, now if those are done, you can kind of focus on Ishiba's shortcomings as a leader of the LDP and his inability to manage the diet and not worry so much about the trade talks. And so I think that was really the more important trigger, that once that was announced, that a lot of hesitant critics within the party, I think, now feel a little more emboldened because they don't have to worry.
So clearly, Ishiba needed more of that Netanyahu energy of allowing the country to go down with the ship in order to preserve his political future by taking this trade deal to the mat. But I don't know. Let's look forward a little bit. How does one become the next prime minister of Japan?
So you already now have a number of aspirants getting ready, sort of waiting for, I guess the flag to go up, and they can start being formal candidates and aspirants for the office again. I mean, you had 9 people run last year. I suspect we'll see a number of the same candidates who ran last year will run again. The one kind of question that the LDP is going to have to figure out this time around, normally when you have a leader quit at a midway through their term, the LDP has kind of emergency rules in place to basically do like a very abbreviated campaign so that you don't have a vacuum for a long time. And that basically limits the role that rank and file dues paying members have. Like normally, like last year, you had this month-long campaign and the candidates crisscrossed the country and they held forums and they met rank and file members, because ultimately the rank and file dues paying members of the LDP would vote, and those votes would determine basically a portion of the votes in the first round of voting, with the other share going to LDP lawmakers. Normally, when you have an emergency election because someone's resigned, you would not have that public voting necessarily, that it generally will be more the lawmakers and party officials at the prefectural level basically making the decision. And given that the party is having a major loss of public confidence, there's actually some pushback now saying that actually we should set the rules for this election to be like a normal election, give the rank and file a say in the matter, and try to have a full public vote basically again, to try to move towards reconnecting with the public, to find someone who actually might appeal to more people instead of just having this be like a, behind closed doors, proverbial smoke-filled room kind of decision.
Okay. All right. So we will leave it there. I do think the next hour of content is still very much relevant for understanding the sort of backdrop to the pain that the LDP is in now, and it's kind of what their what the root of the issues are, and what broader national constraints they're going to be operating under, regardless of who or if someone ends up succeeding in Ishiba. So Tobias, thanks for jumping on, and excited to have you back soon to continue following the very dramatic storylines we have here.
Thanks, Short.
Japanese elections, LDP in crisis, nationalists on the rise, or maybe it's the socialists? Ishiba not long for this world. To catch us up on the past few years and future of Japanese politics, Japan-China, as well as Japan-US relations, I'm excited to welcome on back Tobias Harris, the creator of the Observing Japan substack. He was on first a few years ago to discuss his excellent biography of Shinzo Abe. Thank you to the USJapan Foundation for sponsoring this episode. So, you've decided that we should start the clock at the Abe Shinzo assassination. Take it away.
That's 3 years ago. Of course, during the last Upper House campaign, Abe was doing a campaign stop at a train station in Nara and was assassinated for reasons that at first were unclear and then became quickly clear it had to do with his relationship with the Unification Church, and has set off a whole discussion of the Unification Church's role in Japanese politics. But actually, we're not going to talk about that, because that is less important than, I think, what the impact the assassination has had on Japanese politics subsequently. And I would argue that at the moment that Abe was assassinated, even though at that point he was had been an ex-prime minister for just under 2 years, he really was arguably the most powerful figure in Japanese politics at the moment that he was assassinated. And that's because he was the head of not only the LDP's largest faction, but also really the head of the party's largest ideological tendency. Like, basically the right wing of the party was arguably dominant, even though you had a more liberal prime minister at that point in Kishida Fumio. And, Abe really was in a position to agenda set, because here was this very notable, prominent, powerful ex-prime minister who also was a faction boss, commanded a lot of media attention. Basically, when he opened his mouth, everyone was forced to listen and to pay attention to what he was saying. And just a tremendously powerful insider political figure who controlled a lot of votes essentially within the party, and was instrumental in getting Kishida elected in the first place, and then sustaining his government. And so you notice that when Abe died and is out of the picture, essentially you lost really a fundamental kind of supporting pillar of LDP governance. And you had a few unintended consequences, where his death meant basically the exposure of the relationship to the Unification Church. So that was, sort of one scandal that hit the LDP that they were sort of not really ready for. And then you had a second scandal that's, kind of came in the wake of that, where when Abe was gone, the leaders of the Abe faction who followed him basically decided to start this practice that Abe had ended, where members of the faction, you had these sort of fundraising parties, and they had this practice where everything that you raised in excess of a certain quota that went to the faction was kicked back to you. And they decided to start doing that, but those kickbacks weren't reported by the requirements of campaign finance law. And this, of course, turned into a huge scandal that destroyed the faction system, essentially. That basically led the party to say, okay, that's it, we're done with the factions. So that was, pretty much a direct consequence of his passing. And as a result, the LDP forfeited a ton of public trust, has performed poorly now so did fine in the 2022 upper house elections that happened right after he was assassinated, but in the general election last year, and now the upper house elections this year, the LDP's, the number of votes that it got in sort of the national proportional election portion of the votes in those elections, the LDP got 6 million fewer votes this past Sunday than it did in 2022. So, just an enormous collapse in trust in the party. And in particular, the votes that the party has lost. There's some question about precisely measuring just how much of those votes are kind of more sort of moderate people who are dissatisfied with the direction of the party, and how much of it is people on the right who don't like the kind of post-Abe direction of the party and have been voting kind of in protest to that. But there's a real loss of confidence, of trust in the party, and it has basically meant that now, so not only has the LDP lost public confidence, it now has lost control of both houses of the Diet, and you almost have this kind of death spiral feeling going on right now.
Let's step back and do a little more Japanese political economy fundamentals, because you just threw a lot at our, initiate ChinaTalk audience. What pieces should we start with? Like the sort of general chaos where you have lots of weak rotating prime ministers, what the faction system was, to what extent Abe and his command over the LDP was an aberration, why Japanese politicians in the LDP are just like kind of boring and lame.
I think the main thing to appreciate about kind of the Abe era, and it was 8 years of him in power, and then several extra years of him, as a powerful ex-prime minister. But like that decade, when he returned to power in 2012 onward, was really the capstone of what had been at that point basically 20 or 25 years of attempts by reformers in Japan to make Japan a much more centralized top-down political system. And that, that basically, when the LDP, it's kind of Cold War era period of dominance, it was not a top-down system. It was very much a, people kind of at times talked about the LDP almost as a coalition government, because its factions were, very autonomous and, competed for power and had different beliefs and different personalities. And so they were almost like mini parties in and of themselves. And so the LDP historically, was historically strong, and the governments that it chose were generally pretty weak, and, had weak prime ministers who were considered, sort of first among equals, but, they did not have a lot of agenda setting power relative to other players in the system, including the bureaucracy. And at the end of the Cold War and sort of heading into, the end of the century and the beginning of the new century, that you had a lot of reformers who basically said this is not sustainable. We need a system, we need strong prime ministers who can navigate kind of a challenging global order, and things are changing. We have friction with the United States, we have China rising, that they're challenges that require more capable leadership. And so you had a series of reforms really going back to the early 90s to try to make the system much more top-down, to create much stronger prime ministers. And ultimately, Abe was sort of the product of those, that you had electoral change, you had administrative reform, you had various other political reforms that basically ensured that the prime minister would have the ability to set the agenda, dominate the political system, and basically say, this is what we're going to do, and then follow through on that. And it was kind of a bumpy process to get there, and you had some sort of back, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back when it comes to actually seeing the prime minister reach that point. But 2012 really is, Abe comes back, has really thought about how to govern, how to use the powers that these reforms have produced, and then sets about saying, here's my agenda. I have large majorities in both houses of the Diet, and I'm going to set about doing that. And by and large, he did. He spent 8 years saying, here are my economic policies, and I'm going to, really work on putting those into practice. I'm going to strengthen Japan's self-defense forces. I'm going to press forward with, if not outright constitution change, make some changes to national security laws. Like, he basically did as promised. And that really explains kind of the 2012 to 2022 decade. What we've learned, I think, over the last several years was how much that depended on, sort of that political foundation, which was the LDP consistently winning national elections and ensuring that it had those majorities with which to govern. And that, that in part also depended on a weak opposition. And so kind of on all of those fronts, things have started to churn, and some of that is really, like in a lot of Japan's peers in the G7, the way in which, COVID kind of scrambled everything and kind of changed the political landscape that the parties were operating in, and what had been a very friendly landscape for the LDP post 2021 became a progressively tougher landscape for them to operate in.
And so what are the frustrations of the electorate that are, kind of universal, and what are the sort of like particularist gripes that people have had over the past few years with the governing party?
Like in pretty much every other democracy, post-COVID inflation. In Japan, of course, had wanted inflation for a long time, right? Abe was a reflationist. Like, inflation was the thing they wanted. But of course, the inflation they've gotten has been not necessarily the demand pull, higher wages, leading to higher consumption, leading to, kind of steady increase in inflation. It was kind of more the supply shock kind of inflation from, imports getting more expensive, from a weaker yen because you've got divergence in monetary policy in Japan and other countries. So the yen was weak, and Japan imports a lot of food and a lot of energy, and that was passed through to consumers. And so that really has hurt. Getting kind of more of the cost push inflation has really eroded household incomes. You've really seen a lot of pain from that, a lot of frustration, and that certainly contributed to the LDP losing last year. And if you look at exit polling this year, was the overwhelmingly the issue that voters cared about most this time around. And so the fact that the LDP hasn't really had a good answer to that inflation, that the Bank of Japan has started raising interest rates, but it's still relatively slow, and you still have a pretty big divergence in monetary policy. So the yen has still been relatively weak. And so households feel squeezed. You've had a lot of effort to try to get wages up, but it has been it's a difficult process. It is not something that's happened fast enough to make people feel like they have more money in their pockets. And the LDP just has been punished for appearing to not have done enough. And arguably, and I think last year this in particular was a problem where you had this big scandal, right, where it showed, the LDP kind of skirting campaign finance law and looking like it was sort of taking care of itself at a time where people felt poor. And that really, I think, sort of the confluence of those issues really, really hurt the LDP. And this year was probably a pure, like, inflation. Inflation is up. Real incomes haven't kept pace. And the LDP really has suffered for that.
The kickbacks, if I recall, were like in the hundreds or thousands of dollars, right?
It was. I mean, there's that. Yeah. I mean, like most Japanese political scandals, it's more about the behavior than the amount of money involved.
Is there a Epstein Japan connection? I just asked ChatGPT. It gave me Joy Ito, who's apparently like a VC who took $1 million from Epstein, and then Suga was gonna put him as the head of some digital agency, but had to pull it back. Can we blame him on all this, or?
No. No, I don't think that's. I mean, maybe this is a good segue to talking about the party that everyone is talking about now, which is Sanseito, the new far right party whose leader says that he views his peers as the AFD and Marine Le Pen and Reform UK and so on. Which, I mean, they are thoroughly steeped in kind of online memes, online political discussion in the United States. They've trained their activists, in English so that they can follow sort of online debates. So there is some leakage of, kind of American online political culture into Japanese discourse that way. And Sanseito also, I mean, just going back to how, COVID and its aftermath changed Japanese politics. I mean, that is one very tangible way in which it changed, because it really emerged as a kind of anti-vax group and anti-vax, and then from that, kind of opposing it was anti-globalist conspiracy theorizing, and then has now branched into kind of other kind of more traditional Japanese far right politics, and is now a force, a new force in the political system.
And yeah, how weird is this?
There's a few ways of answering that, because I personally have on multiple occasions pushed back against the idea that Japan has been uniquely resistant to populism, because I just don't think that's true. I think Japanese populism has often looked different than it looks in other countries, because it hasn't generally been xenophobic, just because you haven't had a foreign population to really target with it. But you had populism, because when the bubble burst in the early 90s, there were a lot of elites to get mad at. You had anti-LDP backlash, you had anti-bureaucratic backlash, you had Koizumi govern as a populist. The literature on Koizumi constantly talks about how he governed as a populist, but the elites that he was using populist tools against were members of his own party, because he was, these sort of rural fat cats who had, relied on pork barrel spending and support for building bridges to nowhere and useless roads that nobody was using. So populism in Japan has pretty much, certainly post Cold War, has been an urban phenomenon. It is, urban voters who feel like they don't have enough political power in the system, in the political system, and that they're slighted, their interests are slighted, that their quality of life has degraded, and that they don't have, the political system is skewed against them. And so repeatedly, you have had parties that are populist. You have Isshin no Kai, this, Osaka-based party that emerged about 15 years ago and, has tried to become more national, very much a populist party, anti-bureaucratic, anti-teachers unions, anti-national government. This is not a new phenomenon. I mean, what is new about Sanseito is the degree to which kind of anti-immigrant, anti-foreign population rhetoric has been part of its appeal, and that's because you do have a bigger, you now have a bigger foreign population in Japan than they pretty much have ever had.
Thanks
and it's
to Abe.
more. Thanks to Abe, actually. And I on sort of the to-do list of essays I want to write, I want to write the story of how Abe created Sanseito through his embrace of. If not, he would not call it immigration. It was sort of like a kind of de facto guest worker program, but opening the door, simultaneously opening the door, but as in many other countries, not really wanting to talk about it, like basically trying to, kind of put a lid on the issue and not have sort of a big debate within the LDP about it. That he basically allowed kind of discontent over this to simmer and to grow. Essentially the business wing won out, right? Because, business in Japan wants, like they're basically having trouble getting enough workers to do a lot of jobs. And so they wanted it. But sort of the Abe basically didn't get enough buy-in from his own base, his own sort of right-wing base, and kind of let the problem simmer. And now the LDP is essentially paying the price for that set of choices that Abe made.
Tobias, what's the complaint about immigrants if like unemployment is zero?
It's more, I mean, I don't think it's I mean, you do hear, like, for example, like there's a left-wing party, Reiwa Shinsengumi, that is also anti-immigrant because they think that relying on foreign workers suppresses wages. Basically it's a tool by the business community to suppress wages. So there's a bit of a horseshoe going on there where like sort of the left-wing populists and the right-wing populists both are opposed to foreign workers for their own reasons. And again, this is not something that's unique to Japan. I mean, you see similar kinds of politics in other places as well. But it's more about how do they fit in, right? Where you have there have been some kind of highly publicized stories about foreign communities in certain places where they're not following the rules about garbage disposal, or they make too much noise, or there's an issue with Japan's growing Muslim population and the fact that they need a lot of space for their cemeteries, and that is something generally that is something the local population, Japanese, they cremate more. So it's there's just a lot of kind of culture clash issues that come with this, and that come with Japan just having, yes, I mean, the foreign population is 3% of the whole, so relatively small, but it's increased pretty significantly in a fairly short period of time, and so like there's going to be friction as a result of that. But I think it's possible to overstate the degree to which that's been a factor. And I think a lot of the press coverage of this election kind of outside of Japan has focused, wow, there's this party that has, xenophobic appeals, and it came out of nowhere. And clearly that shows, that this is a big issue overall. And you look at the exit polling, and overwhelmingly it's inflation, not the question of Japan's foreign population. Sure. Sanseito forced other parties to talk about it more than they had been. And certainly their own voters care a lot about this. But I'm not necessarily sure that it's the only reason that people voted for Sanseito, because they were also out calling for, very big tax cuts and limits on, Social Security premiums, and basically like trying to put more money in people's pockets, which is the main issue for a lot of urban voters, which is where they did best, keeping with this idea of, Japan, Japanese populism being, primarily an urban phenomenon. So it's too simple to say, well, this shows, Japan is now joining the kind of anti-immigrant wave everywhere else, and that it's, as salient as it's been in other places. I think it's too soon to say that.
To what extent is like demographic crisis something that has seeped into the political discourse as something politicians like actually try to have plans about?
I mean, it's been part of political discourse for 30 years, and they've tried all sorts of different ideas, and are constantly proposing this subsidy and this child allowance and that like lots of other ideas, and I don't think Japan has had any more success figuring out how to encourage people to have more children than any other democracy facing a demographic crisis. I mean, they've just been at it for longer. And, there is a feeling of, in some ways that Japan has passed a point of no return to a certain extent, where just like a certain amount of decline at this point is baked in. And, every year, the number of new births is kind of setting new records, numbers that you haven't seen since, the late 19th century. So, it's, the crisis is here. I mean, in some ways now, it's, there's two different sides of it, because there's the how do we encourage people to have more children, but then there's also the how do we deal with the consequences of demographic decline now in the moment. How do we deal with the fact that you have rural communities depopulating, and how do we ensure that there's still service provision in these communities? Of course, how do we entice young people to actually want to go live there? I mean, that's a whole other set of policies that have been debated for a long time. And So it's baked into it's everyone has to talk about it, but I don't know if anyone's got any brilliant ideas for how to fix it.
I mean, I think it's just like getting American YouTubers to like continue making those incredibly viral videos of like how they fix up the like beautiful house in the valley or whatever. It's just like a shockingly popular genre. Let's talk Russia connections. There was a whole foreign influence arc in the most recent campaign. How did that play out? What's your read there, Tobias?
So it kind of kicked off when a Sanseito candidate went on Sputnik News and was, and that, of course, then that, Sputnik News like posted that all over Twitter, and, Sanseito then basically said, oh, this wasn't authorized, and they fired someone and, tried to kind of sweep it under the rug. Then you had the Ishiba government actually coming out and saying, we have evidence that says, that there were, sort of foreign bot activities on Twitter, sort of promoting, basically, disinformation about the foreign population in Japan, and basically, trying to, find these wedge issues to divide Japanese against each other, and promoting Sanseito, and Sanseito denied that there was any connection, that anything to do with this. The LDP in the last few days was kind of asking questions about what exactly was happening here. I have kind of a pet theory that suggests that it's possible. I mean, compared to some of the polling that we saw, Sanseito actually underperformed a little bit. It looked like that they were actually, maybe on track to win at least a few more seats than they did. And what I wonder is whether, in sort of the final days, that the Russia connection may have pushed some voters on the margins away from them. That and basically like there was basically no polling after the kind of Russia allegations came out, and so we wouldn't really, just wouldn't have showed up until election day, until we actually saw the numbers. And so it's possible that there may have been some races that went differently because of that, but we don't know for sure. But I think that's something that the Japanese public is likely to take seriously. I don't think there's a lot of good feeling towards Russia at the moment, and so if it turns out that there is more there, it is likely to shape opinions of Sanseito in a pretty negative way. And actually, it's probably also worth mentioning here, and this is something that I think maybe people don't even appreciate, is, Sanseito ran in an election for the first time 3 years ago. It won one seat in the upper house 3 years ago. It won like 4 or 5 seats in the lower house last year. So this is, a party that does not have a big presence, or hasn't until this election. And as a result, it was very fringy. It did not get a lot of mainstream coverage. It did not get a lot of mainstream scrutiny. Everyone just kind of, they're there, but like, we don't have to really think about this kind of goofy party on the fringes. And it has, so most of the attention that it has gotten has been in like the last 5 weeks. And it really did not start climbing in the polls for this election until about 5 weeks ago. So it is, the Japanese media basically has not even begun combing through their dirty laundry, and looking for.
And if people get scandalized by $1,000, single $1,000, illicit campaign finance violations, then as long as that backbone of integrity in the electorate is there, then you wouldn't be shocked to find other stuff going on with these fun YouTube influencer politician types.
And even it wasn't just there may have been even more. There was certainly more smoke than just what the government was saying about bot activity. That one of the big weekly tabloids actually looked through their finance records and found, a series of payments over the course of a few years to some PR company called Vosto that has that basically like changed its its office location a few times. And no one had any what is this company that they made payments for PR help. over the course of several years. So
Yeah, how many Tobias Harrises are living in Vladivostok, giving deep domestic Japanese political takes on how to position to win votes?
Yeah, so it's I mean, I think, like that kind of like that was out then, that was out there for anyone to report on for years. I mean, those were payments, going back to basically the beginning of the party. So that just tells you that they really have only are now going to start getting more scrutiny. And so it's, it's too early to say, oh, this is a party that's definitely here to stay and is going to, be a fixture on the landscape now. We've seen a lot of parties come and go in Japanese politics for a long time, and a lot of populist parties that look, like they have, the wind at their backs, and they're destined to change everything. And, building, a sustainable, durable party, it's not something that can happen over one or two cycles. This is a longer term process. So, we'll see what happens with them after this.
Okay. All right. We're going to take a few more vitamins. How are parliamentary elections structured in Japan?
Well, if we're talking about the upper house elections that just were held, they're a little complicated. So the upper house has 248 seats. Like the Senate, you have, you don't get all of the upper house is not elected at the same time. So they serve, half the house, is on one 6-year cycle, and the other half is on another 6-year cycle. So half the house every 3 years is up for election. And what you have, I mean, like in the lower house, you have essentially a mixed system where a portion of the election is for PR seats. So, national, and in the upper house, it's a national proportional representation list. Each party has its slate. Voters have the option of voting either for a party or for a candidate on one of the party's lists. And then the remainder, so that is, it's 50 seats for PR. And then for the remainder, it's a mix of single member constituencies, basically, so representing each prefecture, but the prefectures get more seats or fewer seats depending on their population. So Tokyo elects 6 members at a time to the upper house. But most of the country only elects 1 member at a time. And in fact, there are 2 prefectures that essentially elect half a representative because they've been fused, 4 prefectures that elect essentially half a representative because they've been fused with a neighboring prefecture because they have too few people. So that's 32 single member constituencies. And then the remaining 13 prefectures have multiple members ranging from Tokyo's 6 to some have 2. So every voter gets 2 votes, one for their constituent representative, one for someone from the PR list or for a party in the PR list. And that makes up the constituency for the upper house. We could talk about the lower house too, but if you want to pause and talk about a little more about the upper house, we can do that as well.
What can parties who aren't in power do?
Try to get more seats. When you mean what can they do in terms of like legislative power, like what role do they have in policymaking, or
yeah.
Okay. So it's it's complicated because generally Japan, I mean, historically, we were talking about, kind of the 30 years of reform and trying to change the system and making the system more top down. I mean, historically, Japan was not a textbook Westminster democracy, where, the prime minister, if they have a majority, they're an elected dictator and they can do whatever they want as long as they have a majority. Precisely because the LDP as an institution was so strong, and the prime minister had to defer to other players in the system. And there were stretches during LDP rule where actually there was a ton of kind of backrooms negotiations between the parties, between the ruling and the opposition parties. So it was never just like a textbook, like government has the votes, it can do whatever it wants. kind of what happened under Abe was that you did get more of a textbook Westminster-style democracy, where you did have Prime Minister wants to do this, he's got the majorities, he's going to do what he wants. And maybe he'll defer, if public opinion is negative, he'll kind of make some concessions to public opinion. But basically was not conceding much to the opposition, and there wasn't really that much the opposition could do about it. In practice, now it's changed again because, well, one, it's changed because after the general election last year, the LDP-led government does not have a majority in the lower house. So it has had to actually concede quite a bit of power to the opposition. And that in practice has meant the leading opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, controls several very important committees in the lower house. And that gives it a lot of agenda setting power and a lot of ability to control how legislation moves, the pace that legislation moves, when votes get scheduled, how long debate takes. And so that the opposition actually at the moment has quite a bit of power. Now, after Sunday's results, you're going to see something similar, at least for the time being, something similar in the upper house, where they want to do anything, they're going to have to negotiate with the opposition parties to get something on the legislative agenda to ensure that the votes exist to pass it. So the opposition parties actually have quite a bit of power to slow things down and to block the government's agenda in a way that they did not have during the Abe years.
Gotcha. All right. So now back to the horse race, folks. Tobias's favorite new entrant to the scene, Democratic Party for the People. What's their deal?
They've been around for, I guess, about 7 or 8 years now. They are a splinter from the former Democratic Party of Japan, which when Japan had this brief flirtation with two-party democracy and even had a actual change of ruling party via an election. Crazy idea doing that in a democracy. In 2009, when the Democratic Party of Japan won a huge majority and swept the LDP into opposition. And when they went back into opposition in 2012, they basically were, almost powerless. Abe ran roughshod over them. They had no appeal to the public. And eventually what happened is that it split into kind of competing post-DPJ parties. And so you have the Constitutional Democrats as the more kind of center-left party, and then the Democratic Party for the People is like a smaller kind of the more center-right splinter party, basically. And it's funny because both the CDP and the DPFP, some people say the DPP, but anyone who's looked at Taiwanese politics at any point, it's really hard. I find it very hard to use DPP. So I feel like just for the sake of distinction, I always say DPFP. But anyway, they're both still backed by organized labor. Like the big organized labor federation, Rengo, is always calling the leaders of the DPFP and the CDP into her office basically and saying you two have to cooperate more. You two have to stop fighting. You two have to stop working across purposes, which is, it's just funny. But what the DPFP actually has tried to do in recent years is it's essentially trying to do this kind of identity change where it started as this party backed by organized labor, but kind of a little more conservative on some things. So more conservative national defense, they'd been pretty pro nuclear energy, just more kind of friendly to kind of Abenomic style policies instead of kind of welfare state centered policies like the CDP. What they've been trying to do is pivot to become a party of kind of the urban young working class, the same kind of voters that Sanseto was trying to appeal to, basically trying to be a voice for these urban working, young workers who generally aren't well served by the existing parties. That the political system has generally not given much voice to these people. They don't really have a political home. And so they've been trying to make this kind of acrobatic move where, without alienating the organized labor supporters, which are still important in some some particular constituencies for the DPFP, without losing that support, trying to make this pivot to being, this party of young urban voters. And it's actually worked pretty well now for the last couple elections. They have, they generally have been much savvier at social media. They really, have tried to do this thing where you try to do campaign rallies almost in the hope of producing viral content that you could then post on YouTube and get shared a lot and people talk about it. And, like their leader, Tamaki Yuichiro, is always doing these sort of like holding his phone out and, kind of like riffing and taking questions from people. I mean, so you're trying to be a little more kind of meeting young voters where they are. And they've had a lot of success for it. I mean, arguably their success this election was bigger in important ways than Sansaito's. And because they have more seats in the lower house, they're a much more important player going forward than Sansaito will be at the moment. So they're part of the picture. They're an important player. They may end up as part of a ruling coalition depending on how things break. And so we've got to keep an eye on them as well.
All right, back to the LDP. What happens next with this sad I don't have a metaphor. All right, Tobias, Tobias, back to the LDP. What happens next with them?
So, the party is in crisis. The party, they are absolutely, they have now lost, as I mentioned earlier.
Or sorry, maybe we start with this. Who's voting for them? It's like they seem really lame. Everyone seems upset with the LDP.
They're still the biggest party in the country, and that's so by a long way. There's you don't underestimate. They still are, they have the most seats. They still have a lot of power in a lot of different places. What is happening now though is that, in some ways what they have tried to do, they've gone through a few phases since 2012. So Abe, I think, tried to make it a much more coherent, ideologically conservative party that could still compete nationally and win in a lot of places. And, to some extent he was successful in that. But I think what we've also seen is that his success depended a lot on voter apathy. If you look at all the elections that were held from 2012 onward, turnout was really low. And what that basically allowed Abe to do was win elections on the strength of the LDP and its coalition partner Komeito's electoral machines. So they're both very good at organizing their votes and getting their voters out to the polls. And if you have low turnout, and particularly if you get independents staying home, you get the LDP has been able to win. And that's how Abe won. Abe won 6 national elections. And, basically you had record low or near record low turnout in pretty much every one of those elections. It's basically like taking advantage of almost you can almost say voter burnout, because during the first decade of the century, you actually had a lot of very high turnout elections. And I think people were really excited about Koizumi, and then they were excited about competition between the LDP and the DPJ. And so you actually had some pretty high turnout elections. And basically after the DPJ failed in office and left office in 2012, I think you just had a lot of exhaustion. I think voters just kind of they were fed up with the DPJ. A lot of independents weren't terribly excited about Abe and the LDP and didn't feel like they had anyone to vote for. And so turnout fell. And what is happening now is the LDP can't take that for granted anymore. Turnout rose actually 6.5 percentage points this election compared to 2022, compared to the last upper house election. And so independents are paying attention again. And the LDP has struggled to keep its own supporters and to get them turning out because, and it's a mix of reasons, right? It's the corruption scandals. It's, conservatives who think that both Kishida and the current Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru were both, too liberal, and they had turned from the true way that Abe had outlined. and therefore they're punishing the party. And so you have a lot of voters for different reasons who might have voted for the LDP in the past who've decided to start punishing the party. And you also have voters who sat out who are now coming back. And a lot of those are younger voters, it seems, coming back and also voting to punish the LDP because they feel like our lives have not gotten any better. You've been in power uninterrupted now for 13 years, and what do you have to show for it? And all of that is turning into this situation now where the LDP does not have a majority in either house of the Diet.
Is it a personality thing? I mean, the fact that we've got Taro Aso at 84 years old still trying to call shots does not give me a ton of confidence. But yeah, I don't know. Like, what's the incentive structure for like a young, upcoming, charismatic politician to sort of try to like revive this like giant carcass of a party as opposed to try to go somewhere different that's maybe more nimble and like more easily bent to the sort of things that you're interested in? I mean, are there kind of deep structural reasons for the LDP not to be able to get it together, or are there sort of people with views and enough folks who see the writing on the wall that you think this is a sort of organization that has the capacity to sort of rebuild a mandate?
So the first part of that question I think is important, where there is a feeling that generational change has not happened. And okay, so you look at when people were elected. Abe was elected in 1993. Suga was elected in 1996. Kishida was elected in 1993. Ishiba entered politics, I think, in 1986. So there is definitely a feeling that the party has been led by these people who've been around forever. They're refusing to release their grip. I think this sounds familiar, maybe in some other context that we could talk about. But I think there's a feeling that really they've really frustrated the ambitions of younger people. In some ways, actually, this was one of Abe's shortcomings, that he ended up kind of filling his government with a lot of people who were loyal to him, who he trusted. So it was a lot of people who kind of came up in politics around the same time as him, and I don't think he did enough to really cultivate that next generation, to really foster talent, to really try to raise up kind of that next generation of leadership. And I mean, it's ironic last year, it's like the young shiny face, the face of generational change, or one of the faces of generational change in the 9-person leadership election last year was Kobayashi Takayuki, sort of this young hawkish guy, but he's 50 years old. Like, that's what counts as young, and a voice of generational change in the LDP. So, I mean, there's a feeling really of, that the party has not confronted that, has not cleared out some of these voices who've been around forever, and they're really paying a price for it. And it means they're out of touch. It means that they don't really have a way of using social media effectively. So they've been all these parties are running circles around them when it comes to actually communicating with younger voters and sort of meeting younger voters where they are, delivering information in ways that are relevant to them. So the party just feels very out of touch in that way. The ironic thing is, though, if you look like when I was, looking at the general election last year and looking at sort of looking at the candidates that were running, the LDP still has a shocking ability to recruit young people as candidates to the party. And that, I think, is probably, to some extent, that's got to be a hangover from the fact that the party was as dominant after 2012 as it was. Because during the years where you did get this sort of nascent two-party competition, the DPJ actually did have some success attracting young people and sort of people who wanted to enter politics, because they could say, well, we might actually have a chance of making a difference in politics and winning, and here's this new and up and coming party, and there's a place for me in that. And then after 2012, everyone said, well, this party's going nowhere. Why would I want to run for them? And actually, that's created a problem, I think, for the CDP, where, not unlike the LDP, they also have not had generational change, right? Where the CDP now is led by Noda Yoshihiko, the last DPJ prime minister who came back into the CDP's leadership last year. And there's this feeling of, the party is still dominated by all these people who were around leading the DPJ when the DPJ was in power. And so you haven't had generational change there. They haven't had an influx of new talent. One question going forward now, that you do have these sort of new up-and-coming parties among the opposition ranks. Does the DPFP get a big surge of kind of new people wanting to run? And I think I've seen that. I think if you look at the candidates that are running, you are getting sort of 20-something, 30-something people who kind of quit their business jobs and say, yeah, I'll run for office. Like, why not? I'll give it a shot. And so you are seeing more of that. Of course, Sansaito has this like huge digital grassroots organization that is bringing outsiders into politics. And so you are seeing more of that. And I'm guessing that now as the LDP, sort of in this crisis and maybe headed into opposition at some point, you may see more of that and more kind of second guessing, oh yeah, maybe I will go, run for a different party instead of joining the LDP. That'll be something to watch. Is there more diversity in the choices that political aspirants take?
How does one get to run for office for the LDP? Like, are the equivalent of something like open primaries? Is it all sort of decided by a party center? How does it work? And I guess once you're elected, like, how much agency do you have to, I don't know, fight the man or kick out a prime minister?
So traditionally in Japanese politics, to enter politics, it was this saying that you had to have the 3 ban, which refers to Jiban, which is a local support base, Kaban, which refers to financial support, basically referring to the bag of money that you have, because Kaban means bag, and Kanban, which is name recognition. So basically what these have added up to is that you've had basically hereditary dominance, because the easiest way to enter politics was, okay, well, you have the name recognition because you're the son of someone, of a politician who's retired. Jiban, your father, usually father, maybe very occasionally a mother, has passed down a support group, like basically the electoral machine that's going to get out the vote for you. And Kaban, basically, like, your parent has been raising money for a long time and is able to pass down that sort of fundraising prowess to you. And so, you had hereditary, really prominent hereditary politics for a long time. And to some extent that has continued even after electoral reform in the 90s, where you got to switch to predominantly single member districts in the lower house. You still have a lot of hereditary politicians, a lot of, kind of seats being passed down to children, particularly in the LDP. Gradually, that process has changed, where the LDP has not a primary system, but essentially like sort of like a casting call. Like, oh, if you're interested in running, like, put your name in, like, apply, and we'll review your application. Mm-hmm. And like that will sort of happen, with like the prefectural party will kind of review applications, and then they can kind of work with the national party to kind of figure out who the candidate in a constituency should be. And sometimes, if you're kind of a powerful enough politician, you can kind of overrule that process. You can sort of dominate that process. And at times it actually has hurt the party. And I think actually probably hurt the LDP in this election that just passed, because Nikai Toshihiro, who is this kind of big power broker in the party, who had been Secretary General, he wanted his son to inherit a seat and supported his candidacy last year against an LDP member who had been kicked out of the party for his part in the kickback scandal. And so Nikai's son lost that election, and then Nikai pushed for him to run for an upper house seat in the prefecture during this election as the LDP candidate against a candidate who was backed by the ousted LDP member Seko, who was an Abe ally. And the independent won against Nikai's son again. So a second
Poor
straight
guy.
election, being unable to win. And so, I mean, there is a feeling that actually people are kind of fed up with hereditary politics, feeling that, politics is sort of this family business that people can't break into. I mean, I think even a few years ago, when Abe's nephew ran for the seat that was vacated by Abe's brother, Kishi Nobuo. So Nobuo's son ran in a by-election for his seat, and he won, but it was closer than you would think it would have been given the prominence of the family. And you had a lot of people in exit polls saying, actually, we don't want hereditary politicians. In fact, the number of people in exit polls saying they didn't want hereditary politicians was bigger than the number of people who voted for Kishi. So, suggesting that some people who voted for him still didn't like the idea that this was the choice they were being given. So there is a lot of frustration at how dominant the political system has been by the familiar names. That the system hasn't been open to new blood, to new voices, to people with different perspectives, and that frustration is boiling over. And I think it does explain at least part of the problem that the LDP is having. I do think it has explained why there's openness to voting for different parties. There's a real sense of a democratic deficit. That it hurts not just the LDP. I mean, it hurts pretty much any established party. Feeling that you have these parties, they've dominated the system. They're not allowing new people in. They're not listening to younger voters. They're not listening to the urban, sort of the downtrodden urban working class, and something has to give. And we're seeing that pressure start to boil over right now.
Well, maybe they'll just need to add another bond, Bazoo Bond, or Buzz Bond, the ability to go viral. Thank you, ChatGPT, for allowing me to make jokes in a language I don't even speak. Kishida, is there anyone else who can fix this? We have Polymarket at 65%. He's gone by the end of 2025. Maybe contextualize that number and, what it would mean if he stayed or what.
So I'm skeptical that Ishiba is going to stay on. So he gave a press conference yesterday. He said, I acknowledged, that, we were dealt a defeat, and, it was a message from the people, and I humbly accept that. And, I'm grateful to the supporters who've turned out for us, and I apologize, to the public for, that we have not earned your trust. The LDP doesn't like losing. No one likes losing. The LDP doesn't like losing. And the LDP has, throughout its history, been shown that it's willing to be quite ruthless when it comes to staying in power. And, it has now lost 2 straight national elections with Ishiba as its leader. It has lost control of both houses of the Diet with Ishiba as its leader. And, is clearly, beyond just the electoral defeats. There are the reasons for the electoral defeats that we've discussed today. You have these new threats on the right who are pulling away the party's voters. There's a feeling that the party is, is closed to new voices, is not listening to young people, is not really delivering for a lot of voters. So Ishiba is likely to bear the blame for a lot of that. And there are plenty of people in the LDP, I think, who would like him gone. The problem, of course, is what then? And there is not an obvious successor. They have a lot of challenges and a lot of things that his successor would have to do. And some of those things are somewhat conflicting. I mean, you need someone who can maybe bring back some of the voters who defected to the right. You need someone who can maybe appeal, kind of generate some buzz around the LDP more broadly. You maybe need someone who can signal that you've taken generational change seriously. You need someone who can negotiate well with the opposition parties who, potentially hold the balance of power in both houses of the Diet now. You need also, not to diminish this at all, you need someone who can sit across the table from Donald Trump and negotiate with the United States and sort of navigate a pretty difficult international situation. And it is hard to think of any likely contender for the LDP's leadership who checks all or even most of those boxes. And also someone who can really kind of build a consensus behind their candidate that they are the person to solve the problems that the party is facing. So, I mean, at this point, if Ishiba survives, it is most likely just because there's no agreement on who best resolves the party's problems, and they're better off just kind of sticking with Ishiba. And I mean, we've even heard in the last couple of days that even some members of the LDP are suggesting maybe it's best for the party just to go into opposition and, you know, kind of have out the infighting that's going to have to happen, just sort of do it while they're in opposition, get themselves sorted, let the opposition parties sort of destroy themselves, you know, and mess up. And then the LDP kind of rides back into the rescue, like in 2012. I mean, this is
That's
a real
pathetic take.
It's
Truly.
It is. I mean, I don't believe. I mean, it is very It'd be very uncharacteristic for the LDP to just willingly say, "Fine, you guys can have power. We're gonna give
Or
up."
like any political party ever.
It's yeah. It's. I mean, yes. I don't expect that to happen. But it tells you something about the state of the LDP's crisis that someone is even being willing to talk like this, you know, and that they sort of recognize that we're kind of at a stalemate. You know, we can't really control the governing process, the legislative process, and we're also deeply divided internally about the direction of the party. You know, the right wing wants to be, you know, sort of a pure conservative ideological party, sort of the more reformist wing of the party. So, you know, Ishiba, the younger Koizumi, they want the party to be kind of more of a, you know, what I think of as almost like one nation Toryism, you know, like we can sort of be the party for all people, and we're not going to be narrowly sectarian, and we're going to, you know, we're the responsible governing party and no other party can fill that role. And we have to be able to do that. And that, conflict has, you know, is essentially, they can't reconcile it. They have, you know, it's like the right wing isn't strong enough to impose its will on the rest of the party. The reformist part of the party, you know, has the premiership, but basically can't force the right wing to give up their vision for what the party should look like. And so until you can kind of figure out what the party should be, they're all just sort of stuck together in this big tent and unhappy about it. And so, you know, I do understand where this idea that, you know, like in some ways, you know, going into opposition could be sort of purifying, right? You almost, like the LDP almost needs what happened in 2009, where they lost to the DPJ. And what actually ended up happening then was a lot of kind of more moderate incumbents lost in 2009. Abe comes back to the leadership in 2012. A lot of the candidates that ended up coming back into the Diet when he won in 2012 were kind of newcomers to the LDP who were much more conservative, who were closer in their politics to him, and they also owed their seats to him. And so you had, like, they were called the Abe children, and that basically helped remake the party into this much more kind of ideologically coherent force that was sort of Abe's instrument for governing. And subsequently, a lot of the Abe children have lost their seats. And, you know, it's a much more diverse party again. And essentially what you need to happen is, you know, you need
some sort of purification ritual that only the voters are going to be able to deliver,
that ultimately,
because there's not enough kind of party discipline, strong leadership to make it happen.
Yeah,
and is that a function of like party rules or incentives, or just like not enough charisma in the building?
I mean, some of it is the numbers, just like the numbers game, you know, that there's still kind of like enough of these, you know, kind of Abe loyalists, you know, that they can make a lot of noise, and they can, you know, they have ways of like being obstreperous and kind of annoying and being a thorn in Ishiba's side. And, you know, that Ishiba, you know, I'm kind of a believer. There was this theory that came out of the study of British politics called like the rubber band theory of the premiership, that was, you know, used to kind of talk about Thatcher's tenure. and that sort of prime ministerial power kind of stretches and contracts, for kind of idiosyncratic reasons that, they're sort of like the formal powers of the office, but in practice, how big is your majority? What do the opinion polls say? What are, what issues, what's sort of the mood of the country? Like all these issues can kind of affect, how much power the prime minister has in practice. And, what's ultimately happened is that, when you lose elections, you have less power. And when you don't have the public behind you, you have less power. And, Ishiba's approval ratings have been underwater for almost his entire time in office. And so he just doesn't have the political capital to really impose his will on the party. He's also, he is someone who, the reason why he, took him a bunch of tries to win to get the leadership and, a bunch of unsuccessful attempts to win is that he was always, he kind of had this reputation of being overly cerebral and sort of happier being a critic on the backbenches than someone who was, good at making friends, good at making allies. That was not the kind of politician he was. And, repeatedly, it didn't do him any favors when it came time to run for the leadership because he just wasn't good at making friends. And, and he was, a constant thorn in Abe's side. So all of the Abe loyalists, they hate him. They have not forgotten, they thought that he was, because I think for Abe, one of the most important things about his approach to politics was loyalty. So, he was, very loyal to the people who stuck by him, and, so repaid loyalty with loyalty. The people who kind of stuck with him after he resigned in 2007, they came, when he came back into power, they came right with him, and he stuck with them, and they were Team Abe. There's no Team Ishiba. There's no, Ishiba does not have, this group of people around him who are, really, populating the key positions in his government and are going to stick with him. And, Team Abe also meant, Abe had this group of people around him who helped him make decisions and ensure that those decisions were followed through. Ishiba doesn't have that. There's not a Team Ishiba running the show and keeping things on track. And so the result has been, there's been a lot of oxygen for the critics to kind of run wild with. There's been a lot of room for the bureaucracy because they're not getting sort of the top-down direction from Ishiba that they would need to sort of loyally implement the prime minister's agenda. And the fact that Ishiba hasn't had hasn't been able to govern with a majority means that he doesn't really have a coherent agenda he's pursuing. He's basically kind of governing from week to week based on, what he can get the votes for. And so, if his rubber band is not very elastic, it is very contracted at this point. And, for a party that got used to decisive leadership during the Abe years, it's been really hard getting acclimated to the idea of a prime minister who actually can't do very much and doesn't have a whole lot of power and hasn't really articulated a positive agenda.
Well, we centered domestic politics partially because selfishly I just find it so fun to talk about East Asian politics where there's like this much transparency into what the hell is going on. But I think also my guess, like all politics is local, I imagine a lot of what is transpiring in the sort of US-Japan and Japan-China relationships is kind of driven by these dynamics. So, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But Tobias, let's close a little bit with sort of what the current domestic political dynamics mean for Japanese foreign relations.
Yeah, I think it has absolutely, domestic politics has absolutely been a factor in what we have seen between the U.S. and Japan over the last, 4 months or so. And, certainly starting on April 2nd onward, you've had a prime minister with not a lot of flexibility domestically and, facing an election and being very conscious of this, what was at stake in that election. And now we're on the other side of that election, and in some ways his situation is not all that much improved because he's still the head of a minority government, and he has spent months talking about how he's not going to make a bad deal. He's not going to make a deal just to keep the U.S. happy, that he's going to defend Japan's equities in these negotiations, and, that getting auto tariffs reduced is a fundamental national interest, and, protecting Japan from rice imports is a fundamental national interest. And he hasn't left himself with a lot of room for compromise. And actually, it's worth just mentioning as an aside that we have actually seen, I think, a change in the politics of U.S.-Japan relations since Trump took office. And, whereas in the past, I think the politics of U.S.-Japan relations were, the first duty of a Japanese prime minister is ensure that the relationship with the United States is going well. And, successful Japanese prime ministers have understood that, and unsuccessful ones have decided to kind of poke the bear, and they've paid the price. And so the incentives are different, where I think there's a lot of anger in Japan over how they've been treated by the Trump administration. And the fact that, Japan has gotten no credit for being, the largest source of FDI in the United States, and being a loyal ally, and actually doing a lot to increase their defense capabilities. And they've got, they feel like they've gotten no credit for that. They feel that, in 2019, when the U.S. and Japan signed an FTA, supposedly there was this, kind of oral promise from Trump to Abe that, he wouldn't raise automobile tariffs on Japan. And there's a feeling that, that promise was broken. So Trump talks about his great friend Abe. And yet, this was how, he treats, Japan. In fact, it did not go unnoticed that the letter he delivered about raising tariffs to 25% on August 1st actually was delivered on the third anniversary of Abe's assassination. That did not go unremarked by Abe loyalists. So there's a lot of bitterness.
How much do you want to bet that they were not aware of that in the White House?
They probably weren't. Actually, they probably didn't think about it at all.
I put an enormous amount of money. This was not on the
but especially since they sent the same letter to they sent the same letter verbatim to a bunch of different countries. But no, it was noticed. It was noticed that when the letter came through, and so there's a lot of frustration. I mean, there was a poll in the Yomiuri Shimbun either late June or early July where something like only 20% or something said that they trust the United States going forward. I mean, that's an extraordinary number. To see that in Japan. I mean, so there's anger, and I think we saw the tenor of politics that Ishiba actually was criticizing the United States on the campaign trail, and said, he's not going to let the United States push Japan around. I don't think he says that if it's not a message that wouldn't be politically useful, and wouldn't if that wasn't going to go over well, I don't think he says that. And so I don't know if it ended up being a huge issue ultimately in how people voted. But it's worth noting that public opinion in Japan on the relationship with the U.S. has changed. And in general, the public doesn't want the government to just make a deal to get Japan off to get U.S. off Japan's back. They want, Ishiba to stand up for the, Japan's national interest, and to not just make a bad deal. And so all of that has, I think, shaped the circumstances that Ishiba's facing now, where he has less, basically a week to try to avoid 25% tariffs. And I don't know if the Trump administration is going to go easy on him, that here you have a prime minister who looks like he's on the way out. And also Ishiba, if he did sign on to a deal that basically betrayed the promises that he made about the kind of deal that he was going to fight for, I don't think that helps his survival either.
Sure.
He maybe he saves himself if he actually convinces the U.S. to sign on to a more, a more mutual reciprocal kind of agreement. But barring that, I don't see a way that this helps him at all.
So we got George Glass over there as ambassador right now. Looks like he was ambassador to Portugal and like a bond trader for his career. It's kind of a different vibe from Rahm Emanuel, but whatever, we'll see. Any Japan-China updates you care to share, or should we leave that for another guest, Tobias?
This might be a good time just to note. I mean, we can always go much more into Japan-China. I mean, and it touches, I think, on the discussion we've been having in a few different ways. So, one, I mean, I would say that China was almost conspicuous by its absence during the campaign in a lot of ways. That it wasn't necessarily, there might have been sort of hand wavy stuff about the security threat from China. But it's interesting, if you look at Ishiba's stump speeches, he talked a lot more about Russia. He kept it was like a standard line in his stump speeches, like right near the beginning, where he talked about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He talked about North Korea, joining in, and then, pivoting to talking about North Korea's missile threats and, Russia and North Korea cooperating in East Asia. So, interesting that, Ishiba was consistently talking more about Russia than China. China also is a factor in what we've been talking about, where, one of the big dividing lines between the right wing of the LDP and Ishiba and Kishida before him, as well as Ishiba's chief cabinet secretary, Hayashi Yoshimasa, is that they're too soft on China. That we can't trust that part of the party because they're too willing to make a deal. And we have seen, kind of gradual reopening of political communication between the two governments. A lot of exchanges of visits now at a high level. The Ishiba government got a ton of heat at the start of the year when there was an agreement reached on relaxing visa requirements for Chinese coming to Japan. It's also played into the kind of foreign population question, because there's a lot of Chinese buying property in Japan now. And so now there's talk about putting restrictions on foreigners buying property. When I was in Japan in March, I feel like everyone I talked to mentioned, like, oh yeah, like everywhere in central Tokyo, it's just Chinese buying things up, coming in with cash, buying things. So it's touching Japanese politics in a lot of different ways. It's there, kind of ever present. But they weren't necessarily front and center during the campaign per se.
Do Japanese political parties have like theme songs for like in general, or like for each campaign in particular? They like walk on music?
Not generally speaking. I mean, in like Abe's ads always had these like sort of like exciting, dramatic, like movie trailer fanfare kind of stuff. The party to look at, the Japanese Communist Party always puts out songs. So, and they actually like they have some like real bops, like you can look for those. I should send them to you. Like they had one for like sort of each of their policy issues.
Oh my God.
They had some really good ones actually. And basically every election cycle they'll do like they'll kind of have like a playlist.
Amazing.
Yeah.
We'll definitely have one of those as an outro music. I'll pick my favorite from the recent cycle. But Tobias, yeah, let's do like a final quick thing on them. Like, what is their deal?
The Japanese Communist Party?
Yeah.
Well, they're, a pretty old, well-established communist party, and generally they've fielded a lot of candidates. Obviously, they never win that many seats. They are like some other more established parties, though. I mean, demographic change is hitting them hard. They have an aging base.
What does communism mean to them?
I mean, they're just like an extreme left party, okay. They're, kind of anti-big business. And, I mean, what often too, they are, very committed to defending Article 9. They are, very opposed to kind of the remilitarization of Japan. they're big on gender equality. In fact, one of the better songs they have from this election cycle is their gender equality song. I mean, so in some ways they're just, like a progressive party. In some ways it's, sort of Cold War era leftism brought into the 21st century. And what they have had to do in recent years is try to become a more normal party, where for a long time, they were like, we are going to run candidates everywhere. We're not going to cooperate with any other parties. We're not interested actually in ever taking power. I mean, they just haven't wanted to be a normal party. And what's happened actually in recent years is that they've been more willing to cooperate with the Constitutional Democratic Party, sometimes to the Constitutional Democratic Party's detriment, because the communist brand is still toxic in some quarters, but they're willing to play with others more than they ever have, because they recognize that they now have a superannuated base, and they're not getting any younger, and so they if they're going to have a role in the political system, they've got to be a little more creative and experimental and try to find new ways of being involved.
Did they meet with the Vietnamese and Chinese and Cubans as brothers in the Internationale, or not really?
So they have tricky relations with China. And this was actually, so during the Cold War, the Japanese Communist Party was more Russia-oriented, and the Japanese Socialist Party was more China-oriented. And so actually, the Japanese Communist Party, very critical of China and right. Chinese militarism, very, very very critical of China's human rights practices. They put out statements that would be indistinguishable from some China hawks on certain issues and in certain language, which is kind of remarkable. So I mean, yeah, they're not always what you would expect as a communist party.
All right, I think we'll just have to invite one of their politicians on the show. I think that's how we're gonna resolve this. Yeah, definitely need more communists on ChinaTalk. That's probably a big hole in our booking. All right, we're gonna call it there. Tobias, thank you so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having me back, and look forward to talking to you again soon.